So let's look at the historical era of the united and divided kingdom, of Israel's kingdom from Judges, the era of the Judges, that comes to an end in the Samuel Chronicle, to the exile in Babylon, the period where the minimalists start saying maybe this is when all of this historical stuff that we've been looking at was invented. So this is the era we've just had first indications of the conquest of Israel moving into the land. And let's start with the figure of Gideon, the judge Gideon, and I'm going to put him at about 1150 BC, roughly. Here is an ostracon, a pottery sherd with writing on it, discovered in 2021, published in 2021 that it was discovered, which bears the name Jerubbaal, unearthed near the ancient city of Lachish. Lachish was like the second biggest city in Israel. Jerubbaal, a name which means let Baal contend against him. We mentioned yesterday the Canaanite storm god Baal. This was the nickname given to Gideon after he destroyed the altar of Baal, as recorded in Judges 6:32. The ostracon dates from about 1100 BC, the time of the Judges, based on typology and radiocarbon dating from organic samples taken from the same archaeological layer in which it was found. This is when archaeologists date things, unless it helpfully has, like, it's got a coin with the date written on it, and then everything below that coin, etc. But it's to do with, the layers in the stratigraphy that you dig down through, the different layers, you're going back in time, and you can tell things like how the form of writing changes over time, how the form of pottery changes over time. And archaeologists have kind of built up this knowledge, and they can now kind of dig down, get an estimate, we found this kind of pottery, it's got this kind of writing on it. We can do some, if you've got organic matter, you can do some radiocarbon dating, and you can kind of cross-reference these different dating methods to come up with your best fit date of the material. So the name Jerubbaal is only ever used for Gideon in the Bible. And this is the first discovery of it in an archaeological context. So due to the uniqueness and rarity of the name, of the nickname, some scholars believe this to be actually a reference to Gideon in the archaeological record. Others would urge more caution about that. I think at the very least what you can say is this discovery is significant in that it affirms that the name Jerubbaal was used during the time period that describes it being used. It's another of those getting the culture right things. At the very least, at the very most, this is an extra biblical reference to a biblical character. And that's the first time, in this conference that we've come across such a potential find. We've been looking at stuff that happened a real long time ago. And most of the evidence that we've come up with has been the kind of internal evidence of the criteria of embarrassment and the external evidence of getting the culture right in a way that seems implausible if these are stories made up hundreds and hundreds of years later, and kind of physical geography, where the Bible mentions, Haran was a place at that time period. Israel was a nation that existed at that time period. Jericho was inhabited at that time period. It seems to be right about those kind of things. But we haven't had anything about individual persons until now, right? What about Samson, the story of Samson from about 1100 BC? Judges 14, 5-6 tells an interesting story, and the 11th century BC stone seal here, this is a very enlarged picture. This thing is about the size of your thumb. Little impression, thought to depict a man fighting a lion. It was discovered at Beth Shemesh, which is mentioned in the Judges narrative in several places, the house of the sun. This was discovered in 2012. Professor Shlomo Bonimovitz, sorry if I've slaughtered the name, says if we're right, it shows that the Samson legend already existed around the area of Beth Shemesh during that time period. So he doesn't say, this proves that Samson was a real person who actually fought a lion. That would be over-interpreting what that data can tell us. But it is a very interesting kind of extra-biblical reference to an idea of there being a guy fighting a lion in the area and time period that the Bible also has a story about a guy fighting a lion. And then you can kind of say, make of that what you will. But again, that seems to mitigate against the story about Samson fighting a lion was something just made up off the top of their head by a scribe who had no access to historical writings or oral testimony or anything that really connected them to being able to tell us accurately about something in that historical time period. Because that would be a pretty big coincidence, right? Judges 16 records Samson's death in the temple of the Philistine god Dagon in Gaza. And they made him stand between the pillars. Samson grasped the two middle pillars on which the house rested, and he leaned his weight against them, and so on. Well, the Gaza temple of Dagon hasn't been excavated. But it was probably architecturally similar to the Philistine temple at Tel Kisa, which was destroyed in the 10th century BC. Here's a picture reconstructing that temple, and you'll notice these two pillars here. These are the foundations of those two pillars in the center of the house. In this case, they're about 7 foot apart. But architecturally speaking, it seems plausible to think that Philistine temples had this kind of architectural construction. And the Bible is right about that. Now, that in itself doesn't prove, of course, that it is right about everything that it reports in the story that features that information. But again, if a biblical story gets a kind of incidental detail about architecture correct, the idea that that story is then invented or written up hundreds and hundreds of years later becomes implausible, I think. And if a story is getting historical details like that accurate, maybe that gives you some reason to think that maybe kind of the main point of what the story is written to tell you might be accurate as well. Again, it's not a proof, but I think it is evidence in favour of. Move on to think a little bit about Shiloh and the Ark of the Covenant. This is Tel Shiloh. Tel means mound, kind of artificial mound. As people built forts or little conurbations for defensive reasons, you'd want it, as high up as available in the area. Look for some sort of mound. And then as people kind of live on the same site over and over again, they can then build on top of the remains of what was there before. And gradually over time, the mound gets bigger and bigger. And then archaeologists come along and they say, oh, look, one of those tells, let's go and dig a trench and dig down through the stratigraphy of the trench and so on. Well, in Joshua 18:1, it talks about Joshua erected the tabernacle of God at Shiloh. Tel Shiloh. In the early 11th century BC, the Philistines defeated Israel at Ebenezer, and the Ark of the Covenant, which had been taken by the Israelites into battle with them, was captured by the Philistines. This is recorded in 1 Samuel 4. And it appears, although it's not directly referenced in the Samuel text, but it appears that the Philistines followed up on that victory over Israel by destroying Shiloh. And you get that from Psalm 78 and from Jeremiah 7. Now, according to radiocarbon dating, Shiloh was abandoned in about 1050 BC and sparsely repopulated during Iron Age T. Here's more kind of reconstructions and aerial imagery of biblical Shiloh. Archaeologist Scott Stripling has been in charge of the digs here recently. He believes his team has found remains of the tabernacle at Shiloh, as well as the city gate and various sacrificial deposits, rooms for storing people's sacrifices that they would bring to Shiloh. He thinks that the tabernacle was set up here in this area of the tell. This is a newspaper headline. A mysterious stone slab, has to be mysterious stone slab unearthed in biblical era temple found near Jerusalem is being linked to the large stone that the Ark of the Covenant was said to rest upon. This is a picture of this large flat stone discovered at Beth Shemesh. We've already mentioned Beth Shemesh. The story of the Ark of the Covenant resting at Beth Shemesh is in 1 Samuel 6. Now the people of Beth Shemesh lifted their eyes and saw the ark. The Philistines had been having trouble with the ark, and they put it on a cart, and the cattle take the cart away, and they arrive at Beth Shemesh. They lifted their eyes and saw the ark and rejoiced to see it. Then the cart came into the field of Joshua of Beth Shemesh and stood there. A large stone was there in the field. So they split the wood of the cart and offered the cows as a burnt offering to the Lord. The Levites took down the ark of the Lord and the chest that was with it, in which were the articles of gold, and put them on the large stone. Now, a large stone slab was uncovered by archaeologists in this town near Jerusalem, which has been interpreted as the one that served as the resting place of the then temporarily lost Ark of the Covenant, the now apparently permanently lost Ark of the Covenant. The stone was found inside a 3,000-year-old square building that experts believe to have been a temple in the ancient settlement of Beth Shemesh. Dr. Ziv Lederman of Tel Aviv University says this would be a rare case. I'll leave you to judge that. He says it's a rare case in which we can merge the biblical narrative with an archaeological find. The ark later left Beth Shemesh and was taken to Jerusalem, but experts argue that the stone on which it rested became revered by the local people who built the temple around it at a later date. And the town was then later captured by the Philistine, who desecrated that building, which remained buried and forgotten until it was recently unearthed. Here's a bigger picture, and you get an idea of the scale because you've got a human in this shot. Professor of Archaeology Avram Faust says there are many dots that connect this find to an old tradition that may have found its way into the biblical story. So again, he's not saying this proves everything in the story, but he's saying, oh, maybe there is this old tradition that they actually did know something historically true that has made its way into the Bible, and this is extra biblical evidence that seems to fit that. Okay, let's think about King Saul and King David and that whole kingly rule, moving on from the period of judges to the era of kings. I'm going to put Saul around about 1082 BC, King David at about 1040 BC. Again, embarrassment Despite being, quote unquote, a man after my own heart, says God, David is presented as a deeply flawed man, an unlikely product, one might think, of fictional national myth-making. Dawkins says King David made no impact either on archaeology or on written history outside the Bible. This suggests that if he existed at all, i.e. he probably didn't, he was probably a minor local chieftain rather than the great king of legend and song. He asserts, as I said yesterday, Dawkins does an awful lot of asserting in a book supposedly designed to get young people to ask for evidence. This, again, is simply a matter of ignorance on Dawkins' part. Dawkins obviously doesn't know that the fragments from an Aramaic stele set up by Syria's king Exile at Tel Dan, this find was published in 1993 and 1995, so it's not like this is recent stuff that may plausibly have escaped Dawkins' notice, that this Tel Dan stele bears the first recognized non-biblical mention of King David in a text that reflects the events of the year 841 BC and would have been set up there soon thereafter. The stele mentions, and it's highlighted here, the House of David. Eric Klein, who's a professor of classics, anthropology and history at George Washington University, he says the finding of this inscription brought an end to the debate about whether David existed and settled the question of whether David was an actual historical person, settled it positively. Here's a bigger quote from the find. I killed, the stuff in brackets is the kind of reconstruction of stuff that's either missing or too damaged to clearly make out. I killed Jehoram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, and I killed Ahazahua, son of Joram, king of the house of David. And I set someone else up in his place, etc. There's also the 9th century BC Mesha inscription, or sometimes it's called the Moabite stone, line 31 of which says, "And the house of David inhabited Horonanim." Horonanim is mentioned in Jeremiah 48. In recent research using new scanning technology to make the inscription clearer, Dr. Michael Langlius notes that the most likely reading of this inscription is Bet David, that is, House of David. The new imaging technology that we have confirms the reading of Bet David. It's a good thing when science can confirm a hypothesis. That's from a Times of Israel report in 2019, so relatively recent research backing up that reading of the Moabite stone. So we can cross out quite a lot of what Dawkins has asserted here already. But what about this? King David was probably a minor local chieftain rather than the great king of legend. Right? Okay, let's say, yeah, he existed, but the Bible must be mythologizing him. Again, here's some recent research. A 2024 peer-reviewed study of carbon-dated samples from several locations in ancient Jerusalem produced evidence indicating the widespread habitation of Jerusalem during the time of David and Solomon. Thanks to this study, we can say with much greater confidence than before that Jerusalem at the time of David and Solomon was more a city than a village, as the minimalists claim. And here's an artist's depiction of Jerusalem at the time of David. Of the 103 carbon samples, mainly of seeds from Jerusalem, 18 of them, that's almost 20%, fell within the early Iron Age. That's the 12th to 10th centuries BCE. So this clearly indicates widespread occupation, stated the report. Although the study cannot reveal the nature of Jerusalem's construction in the 10th century, it does reveal that the city was densely inhabited at the time. Of course, archaeologist Dr. Aliat Mezar, who died fairly recently in 2021, has been the lead archaeologist on what she thinks is King David's palace. She thinks King David built this palace. Other archaeologists think maybe he used this palace, but there was already a structure there. There's some discussion about this, but it is a monumental structure. On this diagram, the step stone structure, as it's called, which is depicted in the gold colour, supports what's called the large stone structure in the kind of blue above. The buildings on the side of the step stone structure down here are later additions. Also, very recently, this is research that kind of came to light in 2024, evidence of worship in the rock-cut rooms on the eastern slope of the city of David, Jerusalem. You have to kind of take out of your mind's eye the modern iron covering of this place, and you have a series of rooms cut into the bedrock and a kind of complex, which they think was of religious ceremonial significance, as archaeologists want to say. Jewish archaeologist Eli Sukron associates this site with Melchizedek, the Abrahamic 18th century BC priest of Salem, that is Jerusalem, mentioned in Genesis 14. I would urge caution about that. No inscriptions were found to associate these finds with Melchizedek. Shukron himself admits it's impossible to know who used it and in service of what gods. He thinks it was plausibly first used by Canaanites and then continued to be used by early Jews. King David conquered Jerusalem and made it his capital after he'd become king. The report by Shukran et al., the actual archaeology report, describes a cultic complex likely constructed in the Middle Bronze Age. Some pottery finds are dated to the 18th century BCE, with its final stage in Iron Age 2B. They say, we suggest that this area was used in the Iron Age for ritual activity, perhaps as a temple. The settlement in this area probably began in the transition from the Middle to the Late Bronze Age, around about 1550 BC. This complex went out of use in the mid-8th century BC, and it went out of use in an organized and orderly manner. Shukron says the structure ceased to function during the 8th century BCE, possibly as part of King Hezekiah's religious reforms. Because they're saying it wasn't just destroyed, it was kind of orderly, in an orderly way, put out of functional use. Christian archaeologist Scott Stripling, who he mentioned in relation to Shiloh, believes that this site may have been the location where King David set up the tabernacle to house the Ark of the Covenant when it had moved on from Shiloh. These rock-hewn rooms had walls but no roof. A tent could have been placed over them, he says. Moreover, the Bible indicates that David set up the tabernacle above the Gihon spring, a couple of biblical references there, and that's where this structure is located. This is, if I can get the pronunciation of this, Khirbet Kifa. It's a city, circular city. It's got walls that have rooms in them. It's got kind of city gates at either side of it, and so on. Archaeologists Joseph Garfinkel, Sarganon, and Michael G. Hazel, this is their 2018 book about they were the archaeologists doing this site. And they report that Khirbet-Kefir excavations showed that at the end of the 11th century BCE, an urban society and central monarchy began to take shape in the Kingdom of Judah. They say that the proposal that the Bible was written many hundreds of years after the events it describes, and that it reflects only the period in which it was written, the later, supposedly, period, they say, is no longer sustainable. They say historical processes and cultural phenomena referred to in the Bible relating to the 10th century BC find concrete expression at Khirbet-Kefir at the same time period. Such clear examples of correspondence between archaeological finds and the biblical tradition stand in contrast to the theories of scholars advocating the minimalist approach, and their assertion that the Bible was written during the Hellenistic or Persian period, or even at the end of the 7th century BC, and contains no historical memory, but who have no data or finds to support their views. It's a very strong statement. A late 11th to early 10th century BC inscription on a storage jar was discovered at Khirbet-Kefir, and it bears the words, Ishmael, son of Beda. Interestingly, Saul himself, King Saul, had a son by that name, according to 1 Chronicles 8. Now again, you can't say proof of this person, but historical verisimilitude. This inscription confirms the use of the name for figures belonging to the same time period. Moving on to later periods in Israel's history, names like this that include the term Baal fall out of use. And it takes research to know that. Research that Jewish scribes later on, hundreds of years later, very likely didn't have. Now, it's worth mentioning that Professor Emil Pusch thinks that another ostracon inscription discovered at Khirbet-Kefir represents the earliest known text relating to the establishment of some form of administration in the Israelite society, likely referring to the installation of the first king, Saul. But this interpretation is very controversial. Different scholars give completely different readings and interpretations of this ostracon because the 5-line text is badly abraded and can't be deciphered with certainty. It's probably a bit of a case of people seeing what they want to see in it. In 2023, Professor Garfinkel argued that similarities of design, construction, and material presence of several fortified 10th century BC Jewidite sites demonstrate the presence of a centralized government. He says, during the early Iron Age too, the Kingdom of Judah encompassed at least 3 cities, Khirbet-Kefir, Beth Shemesh, and Tel En-Nafesh. They featured the same underlying urban plan, comprised of an outer casement city wall, that's one of those walls with rooms in it, and a belt of houses abutting the casements, on the one side and facing a peripheral road on the other. Furthermore, none was more than a day's walk from Jerusalem, and thus may be considered as marking the kingdom's geographical core. They were positioned to guard strategic roads leading into the kingdom. Khirbet-Kefir controlled the Elah Valley, Beth Shemesh controlled the Sorek Valley, Tel En-Nashab controlled the northern road to Jerusalem. So from the similar construction and the location, he argues that it's plausibly interpreted as a centralized control of an area being exerted from Jerusalem. So again, more of what you'd expect from a kingdom rather from a minor local chieftain in charge of some little village somewhere. 2 Samuel 8 and 1 Chronicles 18 record David's victory against the Edomite Syrian forces in the Valley of Salt in the Dead Sea region, following which, quote, he put garrisons in Edom, and all the Edomites became David's servants. Here's a figurine of an Edomite goddess. Again, recent research. This was from a talk by Dr. Tali Erickson-Gini, who's the former Israeli Antiquities Authority archaeology inspector for the southern Negev. A 2024 talk, and she talks about the United Monarchy garrisons, towers, and water systems in this area south of Jerusalem from the 10th century BC. She says you can see how these forts are lining roads. They're lining along wadis, which are used as roads, and they're blocking wadis. So there was a great amount of control exerted through this series of forts, fortifications. She notes the existence of over 60 fortified sites. She says there's probably even more fortifications that have not even been investigated. There have been areas that have not been properly surveyed yet. There are smaller sites that are towers that are dotted along roads going between bigger sites. So this very much chimes with what the Bible claims about David in the 10th century exerting control over the former Edomite-controlled region and putting garrisons in there, and so on. Garfinkel and co-authors all highlight the basic and fascinating correspondence between the location of the important Philistine centres that emerges from archaeological historical research and the geographical location mentioned in the biblical traditions. For example, the biblical story of David and Goliath relates how the Philistines camped near Succoth before retreating to Gath and Ekron. If the story was written at the end of the 7th century BC, during the Persian or Hellenistic era, when these cities no longer existed, its author would probably have noted Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Giza as the cities from which the Philistine forces originated. It's thus clear that the biblical author had access to historical information, they argue. In 2005, excavations in the Philistine city of Gath, known as Tel Es-Safi, revealed a Semitic inscription dating to the 10th to 9th centuries BC, bearing two Indo-European names that resembled, I emphasize, Goliath. Aaron Mayer, head of excavations there, says the inscription shows us that David and Goliath's story reflects the cultural reality of the time. Let's pause briefly to consider the matter of this story. Is this like, again, is this mythologized? Is this like David in the beanstalk? Or is this historically plausible? 1 Samuel 7:4 says, and there came out of the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. And I'm like, okay, how big is 6 cubits and a span? If you look at older commentaries on this, you'll find a range of heights given from around about at least 9 foot 9 through to 10.5 foot high. At the lower end, maybe like 8'5". So quite a range of like, well, how big is a cubits and span at this time and period? And we know that there were different types of cubit, like are you talking a royal cubit or a standard cubit? Is that a royal Egyptian cubit or etc.? Right? And lots to debate there. J. Daniel Hayes notes that in the major Septuagint, that is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, the so-called LXX, the 70, because it was traditionally said to have been translated by 70 scholars, the Septuagint, or the LXX, those manuscripts, Goliath's height is given as 4 cubits and a span, which puts him at about 6'9" in the Greek text translation. Only one large substantial manuscript of 1 to 2 Samuel was discovered at Qumran, referred to as 4Q Sama, and in this manuscript, which is by far our oldest Hebrew manuscript of this text, Goliath is listed as 4 cubits and a span, 6'9". Now remember, in ancient cultures, people used to be shorter in general. Right? I come from the historic city in England of Portsmouth. We have Lord Nelson's flagship, the Victory. If you've ever gone on a tour around the Victory, the tour guides are forever having to say, "Watch your head." It's a ship as well, so it may have been shorter. But if you've visited ancient buildings, well, you'll know, if you're my height, you have to really duck down to go in through the front door of an ancient building. Because people used to be shorter. So you didn't have to be all that high to seem really high, right? Jeff Chadwick of Brigham Young University accepts the reading of 4 cubits and a span, using the measurements for the cubit and a span that he determines from his 7 years of research. He reckons that to be about 7 foot 8 inches. This is Oliver Rio, born 2006. He is standing next to a 6'2" tall guy. I'm 6'1 3/4", so in shoes, which I'm not wearing today, I'm 6'2". And he's standing next to a guy who's 6'2", right? Oliver Rio is a Canadian college basketball player. In 2004, he was 7 foot 9 inches tall. That's 2.36 meters. Clyde Billington tries to harmonize the Hebrew, the majority Masoretic text, it's called in the Hebrew, and the LXX text, heights, by distinguishing between royal and common cubits. To say, no, they seem to contradict each other, but they're talking about the same thing because they're using different cubits. And assuming a 16.5-inch cubit would indicate that according to the 6-cubit Masoretic text, Goliath was about 8 foot 11. Taking 6 cubits as a round figure, and the Bible often uses round figure, Billington reckons it's nearly certain that Goliath was not 9 foot tall. But it is likely that he was over 8 foot. And he may have been as tall as 8 foot 7. He also argues that David may have measured Goliath with his helmet still on, and that would shrink his height somewhat. Like, where are they measuring here? So contemporary scholarship would put the height of Goliath somewhere between 6 foot 9, or maybe 7'8", and 8 foot 11, but not 9 foot 9. James Rochford notes several people throughout history have grown to extreme heights as a result of gigantism. For example, the up to 7 foot 1 Potsdam giants in the 18th century Prussian regiment of infantry, ceremonial regiment of giants. The 18th century Swedish-Finnish giant Daniel Kahanus, 7 foot 8. Andre the Giant, who you may know from films like The Princess Bride, 7 foot 2. Robert Wadlow, who's the officially tallest man in the world according to Guinness Book of Records. He was 8 foot 11. This is a picture of Wadlow on the left here. He died in 1940. 8 foot 11. And John Middleton, a 17th century English bodyguard who was probably around about 7 foot 9. Now, while gigantism and acromegaly often lead to clumsy and uncoordinated people, folks like Wadlow here, that's not always the case. People with gigantism tend to have a growth on their pituitary gland, and that kind of have knock-on physiological effects and can lead to things like partial narrow sight or blindness in one eye, that sort of thing. It seems unlikely that Goliath would have survived to become a fighting champion if he couldn't really get about easily and couldn't see well. As people like Malcolm Gladwell has tried to argue that this is what explains Goliath's great height. So that seems unlikely to me. But it's not always the case that these very tall people are suffering from these ill effects. The soldiers in the Potsdam Giants, Andre the Giant, the wrestler Big Show at 7 foot, Performer Willie Camper here was 8'7". He was a sideshow performer. All examples of incredibly strong and coordinated men who were highly athletic. Let's look at King Solomon, and then we'll draw this section to a close. So we're going to put him about 1000 to 930 BC. King Solomon's Mines. Has anyone ever read the Rider Haggard novel or seen one of the many films loosely or otherwise based on King Solomon's Mines? We get the mention of the gold of Ophir in Isaiah and 1 Kings. Well, we do have an 8th century BC ostracon that mentions Ophir gold of Bet Horon, 30 shekels, from the 8th century BC. And it's thought that the gold of Ophir most likely actually came not from Africa, but from the area of India or perhaps Sri Lanka. But Solomon is not only associated with gold. These are David and Solomon's Edomite copper mines. We had earlier the story about David fighting and then taking into vassalship the Edomite area. The Edomites were copper miners. And this copper mining site was considered to be a late Bronze Age site that was related to the Egyptian New Kingdom of the 13th and early 12th centuries. Until more recent research. Tel Aviv University archaeologist Ben Yosef says that high-precision radiocarbon dating of donkey dung found at this site, as well as of textiles at the site and other organic material, showed that the mining camp's heyday was actually in the 10th century BC, the era of the biblical kings David and Solomon. Ben Yosef says that if the Bible's claim that David brought the Edomites to heel is accurate, there's a serious possibility that Jerusalem got its wealth from taxing these mining operations. We're told in the Bible that Solomon embarked on a building campaign that included the first temple, of course, in Jerusalem, 1 Kings 7, and many implements used in the temple were made of something that's referred to as Neshotheth, i.e., we think copper or maybe bronze, which requires copper to form the bronze alloy. So that would tie in with Solomon having access to a source of copper, getting money and materials that he then uses for the buildings. Look at 1 Kings 7:45. Talking of textiles from the site, royal purple. This is astonishing. Scholars have identified argamon, royal purple dye, on 3 pieces of ancient fabric discovered at the Timna Valley copper mining site, dated using carbon-14 to 1000 BC, the era of David. This purple dye is mentioned in numerous biblical passages and is associated with the tabernacle in like Exodus and with royalty. And think of Jesus saying in Luke's gospel, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these flowers of the field. But nonetheless, it is pretty, the fact that you can think, what colour was royal purple dye, was argamon dye in the Bible, that King Solomon and King David probably wore things made of this colour, because this was expensive stuff reserved for royalty and special use. Maybe it's faded a bit over the years, but there you are. You can look and see for yourself. Royal purple. Isn't that astounding? Solomon's city gates is has been an interesting ongoing discussion. Here are some overhead views of the layout of the city gates at different cities in Israel, at Hazor, Megiddo, Jerusalem, and Giza. And you can see that they have a very similar construction. The chamber layout, even the measurements, which are parallel to one another to the nearest centimetre. bespeaks again of a centrally organized architectural influence and plan over a kingdom. Now, there's been controversy about this suggestion. Here's Tel Giza and the six-chambered gate at Giza, which exemplifies this large-scale building program of the biblical Solomon, mentioned in 1 Kings. But biblical minimalists had a comeback. They argued for a later 9th century BC dating of these gates, and they associated them with the later King Omri, not with Solomon. But a radiocarbon dating study by archaeologist Lyndall C. Webster and colleagues, published in 2023, showed that the gates, defensive walls, and large administrative buildings at Giza date to the early 10th century BCE, putting them in the right time frame to have been built by King Solomon. According to Webster, this puts David and Solomon back on the table for being involved in at least some of the monumental architecture in the area. These results would seem to rule out the Omrides. Now let's finish with looking at Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The story of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. There's the kingdom of Saba down in the south of the Saudi, just under Saudi Arabia, modern-day Saudi Arabia, in what is now Yemen. Here's another of those little ostrakhan things. Discovered in 2012 during excavations at the Ophel site in Jerusalem by Elliot Mazar, who we mentioned earlier. The small inscription, just 7 letters, puzzled scholars for many years. While most have assumed the inscription was written in Canaanite, recently a new interpretation has been put forward by a guy called Daniel Vainstub of Ben Gurion University. He believes it's written in Sabic, the language of the ancient kingdom of Saba, that is biblical Sheba. Dated to the 10th century BC, the time of King Solomon, the inscription could provide evidence, maybe this is evidence of trade connections between ancient Sheba and Jerusalem from that time period, which is interesting. Then we get this division between the unified kingdom and the north and south kingdoms, the era of the 2 kingdoms that leads into the conquest. I just love the name of this. This is my photo from the British Museum in London. British Museum in London is a great place to go and visit if you have the time. You can't do it all in a day, it's so big, but you can get around the biblical highlights in a day. And there are actually people who will run Christian-led tours of the British Museum to show you all the interesting biblical-related artifacts and give you background on them and so on. But this is the so-called Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III. He's king of Assyria from the 9th century BC. And on this panel, which I've enlarged here, it mentions Jehu, king of Israel. Again, an extra-biblical archaeological mention of a specific person who's mentioned in the biblical text. And this is definite. The first one we had was with the house of David, so that does seem to suggest there was a King David, that's generally accepted. And here is a very explicit mention of Jehu, king of Israel. 9th century BC, he's mentioned in 2 Kings. And the writing that goes with this says, the tribute of Jehu, son of Omri, I received from him silver, gold, a golden bowl, a golden vase or vase, depending on where you come from, with a pointed bottom, golden tumblers, golden buckets, a lot of gold, tin, and a staff for a king and spears. This is the tribute given by Omri. This is kneeling figure here is probably the ambassador of King Jehu kneeling in front of the King Shalmaneser. There's Jehu on our timeline and Shalmaneser III in the Neo-Assyrian kingdom. And then we get King Hezekiah, born about 700 BC-ish, at the time of Sennacherib and the Assyrian Empire. When Sargon II, king of Assyria, died in 705 BC, subject states tried to throw off their subservience. Hezekiah, king of Judah, stopped paying tribute and entered into a league with Egypt. In 703, Sennacherib, who was Sargon's son, began campaigns to quash that opposition to Assyrian rule, and Hezekiah expected the Egyptians to come and help him. They did not. Dun, dun, dun. Hezekiah was 25 years old when he became king, says 2 Kings, and he reigned in Jerusalem 29 years. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him. This is a seal impression, again, smaller than shown here, a seal impression that says, belonging to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah. This is Hezekiah's famous tunnel. There was a spring at Jerusalem, and knowing that they were probably going to come under siege, he had people dig a tunnel to bring that spring water into the city so that they would have access to spring water and the invading camping army would not. And fascinatingly, they started digging from 2 ends in the bedrock and worked their way towards each other, and they actually managed to find each other and meet in the middle. It's a bit, but they got there. And that's an astounding feat of engineering. And we even have at the entrance to the tunnel an inscription that tells about the work of the digging of the tunnel. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. Lachish, second city of the land, which we've mentioned before, in 1701, it was captured by Sennacherib. In the British Museum again, they have this room of these beaten metal panels from Sennacherib's palace showing his conquest of Lachish. And you can see all these soldiers with arrows here, firing up arrows at the walls of Lachish and so on. In Isaiah 37, we get that Sennacherib received a report that Tinaka, the king of Cush, was marching out to fight against him. And when he heard it, he sent messengers to Hezekiah with this word: "Say to Hezekiah, king of Judah, do not let the God you depend on deceive you when he says, Jerusalem will not be given into the hands of the king of Assyria. I've got to go and quash this other rebellion, lickety-split. But as the Terminator says, I'll be back. Don't think I've let you off." Nobody knew who this Tanaka was. Extra-biblically, there was no record until we dug it up. Here in the British Museum is a statue of Tanaka being represented under the protection of his god, Amun. That's the god that he relies on. So there is Tanaka in Sudan. And this is, of course, the period of the prophet Isaiah. And here we have a seal impression, which with a little bit of plausible interpretation probably says belonging to Isaiah the prophet. Dug up just south of the Temple Mound by Elliot Mazar. There's a little bit of reconstruction involved, but the upper portion of the impression is missing, as you can see. The left side is slightly damaged, it's smudged by a fingerprint. But reconstructing a few Hebrew letters in the damaged area would cause the impression to read belonging to Isaiah the prophet. And the time and the location that it's found would also support that. And Isaiah 37, this is what the Lord says concerning the king of Assyria. He will not enter this city or shoot an arrow here. He will not come before it with shield or build a siege ramp against it. By the way he came, he will return. He will not enter the city, declares the Lord. I will defend the city and save it. The angel of the Lord went out and put to death. The translation of the number here is probably more plausibly 5,180 men of the Assyrian camp. When the people got up the next morning, there were all the dead bodies. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, broke camp and withdrew and returned to Nineveh and stayed there. No longer would he be back. But we have the Sennacherib prism that records from their side of the campaign what went on. And we can compare and contrast their account with the biblical account of this failed siege. According to Sennacherib's prism, as for Hezekiah the Judahite, who did not submit to my yoke, 46 of his great walled cities, as well as the small towns of their area, which were without number, by levelling with battering rams and by bringing up siege engines and by attacking and storming on foot, I besieged and took them. Hezekiah himself, like a caged bird, I shut up in Jerusalem, his royal city. I threw up earthworks against him. The one coming out of the city gate I turned back to his misery. In other words, he besieged the city and cut it off, but is not talking about earthworks against the city walls. He's talking about siege fortifications that stop people from leaving the city. I turned back to his misery. His cities which I had despoiled, I cut off from his land and gave them to various people. What's that? I didn't tell you what happened to Jerusalem. Nothing to see here. It's kind of interesting. Here are the Assyrian assault ramp and the defences of Lachish. This is the assault ramp that they built against the tell and the walls up here to attack the walls of Lachish. And they destroyed various places. Now, there is no evidence that Sennacherib laid siege in this way to Jerusalem. Here are stones and arrowheads and things found near the main gate at Lachish from that conquest. When you're talking about slings in David and Goliath and so on, this is what you're talking about. Interestingly, the Greek historian Herodotus in the 5th century BC, so quite a bit later, but still, the Greek historian Herodotus writes about the destruction of Sennacherib's army at what he calls the entrance to Egypt. Now you look at our map and where Israel is on the way into Egypt. He says that a plague of field mice chewed up the Assyrians' leather bowstrings, quivers and shield straps so that they couldn't fight. And he attributes this destruction of the affecting fighting power of the Assyrian army to divine intervention. That's a Greek historian's view. So we've got 3 different cultures' views on the same event. So what we can say, I think, is the evidence that we have indicates that in contrast to what we know happened at Lachish, Sennacherib didn't actually attack Jerusalem. He didn't take Jerusalem. The Assyrian army was suddenly rendered impotent in some way, without human intervention, and Sennacherib returned to Nineveh and never returned to finish the job, as he already had once before, showing how determined he was to finish the job.